We are now ready for our second panel of the Whole Child Symposium, Fall 2014, on teacher leadership. This second panel is taking a more on-the-ground look at teacher leadership and how it plays out more in the schools and in the classroom as well. The first one was more around systems and organisations, but we also want to hear not only from what's going on outside of schools, we want to hear what's going on inside of schools. So we have our on-the-ground practitioner panellists here. And I believe many people may recognise our panellists or some of our panellists. To my left, we have Peter DeWitt. Peter DeWitt is a former K-5 teacher who is now a visible learning trainer facilitating workshops with schools nationally and internationally. He also presents on creating inclusive school environments and connected leadership. He writes the Finding Common Ground blog for Education Week, which is the most read opinion blog on Ed Week. Is that correct?
Oh, I don't know. I'll have to check in with my editor on that one.
Okay, we'll get back. Well,
don't want to.
You can get back to me on that one, but it's one of the most read.
It's the most read ever. Okay. So,
most read.
Well, let's just go with it.
By the DeWitt family.
By my mom.
Okay, that works. And co-authored the 2014 ASCD ARIA's publication, School Climate Change. How do I build a positive environment for learning, which I believe has got rave reviews.
Yes.
Okay.
Who is my co-author?
We'll leave that one hanging for the moment. In the middle, we have Robyn Jackson. Robyn is a former high school teacher and a middle school administrator, the founder and president of Mind Steps Incorporated. She wrote the ASCD books, Never Underestimate Your Teachers, Instructional Leadership for Excellence in Every Classroom, and Never Work Harder Than Your Students, and Other Principles of Great Teaching. Welcome, Robyn. And those do have rave reviews, both those books.
Well, I've been paying people to do that.
Oh, is that why? And we also have Jennifer Orr. Jennifer is a National Board Certified Teacher in middle childhood with experience teaching 1st, 4th, 5th grade students. Bit of a range there. She currently teaches kindergarten. Bigger range as well. Well done. In 2012, she received the International Society for Technology in Education's K.L. Bitter Vision Award for her work as a K2 educator, bringing technology into the classroom effectively and with innovation. And she is a member of ASCD's 2013 Emerging Leaders class. And when's your book coming out, Jennifer?
Oh my, there are several that we've talked about, but
okay,
we'll see.
Wonderful. So I'm going to lead off with the question that we asked the first panel, but to get your perspectives on this. And we've changed it slightly towards the end though. And really I want to ask people, and we'll start with Peter, since you're closest to me, what is a teacher leader? And why is this role important, key or critical to teaching and learning in the classroom?
I think for me, I was a school principal for 8 years, so for me, a teacher leader was somebody that was that go-to person that would stretch my thinking. So would stretch the thinking of an administrator, but also the person who was the go-to person for the rest of the staff who may have had expertise in one area. So we had teacher leaders who were, definitely excellent with technology, and they would run little workshops for colleagues. So for me, I see teacher leaders as being in different niches around the school, which is a good thing because it means it's opening it up for the staff to sort of have an expertise in one area or another. I think they're important for students because, it's one of those things where you get to see teachers collaborate, and role modeling on the part of the adults is really important for the students to see. How well we collaborate with one another. So, I think that there are just many, many quality implications where that's concerned too.
Okay, that's nice. We hadn't actually mentioned that point before. We talked about how we want to teach leadership skills among students in collaboration. And maybe you don't have the systems in place to get it moving with the teachers, but having the role models there is important as well.
I think our students pay attention to everything that we do, even though we don't think they do.
Yeah.
And we, it's up to us to have a positive model for them to see.
Nice. Robyn?
Well, a few years ago, I did a project called the Master Teacher Project, and we contacted master teachers all over the country to try to figure out what is the secret sauce, what makes somebody a master teacher. Well, we couldn't find any commonalities except for two things. First of all, a master teacher is someone who says, I don't care who the kid is, I don't care what their background is, put them in my classroom, I'm going to help that student learn. But the second quality we found was that every master teacher had the same story. They all had a story that where their pivotal moment where they became a master teacher was that moment when another teacher in the building stepped inside of their practice and showed them something that helped expand their own practice. And so for me, a teacher leader is that person that steps inside another teacher's practice and expands that teacher's practice. And that's why they're so important, because based on what I've learned, a master teacher becomes a master teacher because of that experience. And the whole idea about talking about teacher leadership is to make that experience something that isn't accidental. I don't want my ability to become a master teacher to be limited by my access to a teacher leader in the building. So why wouldn't we make this something that is a lot more of a deliberate experience where we have people strategically placed to step inside the practice of other teachers and expand their practice so that they become better. So for me, that's the big important part of being a teacher leader. And that definition transcends formally defined roles in the building. And with that definition, every teacher and any teacher can at some point in their career become a teacher leader.
Yeah, and as you were saying, it shouldn't be fortuitous. It shouldn't be that you happen to be in the right school, in the right environment, at the right time, and stars aligned, and then you're able to become a teacher leader.
Right.
It should be more organised or recognised or respected or possibly systemised.
Right.
Yeah. Jennifer?
I think the term really defines itself. When we talk about a teacher leader, we're talking about somebody who is a teacher, somebody who is regularly working with students, be that somebody who's in a classroom in a content area or a grade level or a guidance counselor or a coach, but somebody who is linked directly to a classroom or to groups of students, who daily is interacting with students. And I think that matters because I think that means that what they bring to the leader piece of the role is different than other educational leaders and experts. And while all those perspectives and ideas are important, I think a teacher leader who's engaging in the day-to-day work of education, just as all teachers are, comes to the table with a unique perspective. And that when it comes to leadership and policy and decision-making, be it at the team level, school level, district level, more broadly, that the teacher leader's voice is critical.
Okay. I want to go back to something that the other panel said as well, when they talked about how they believe we're at a tipping point of teacher leaders or leadership becoming more the norm in schools. And since most of you are currently in schools or have been recently in schools, I want to get your interpretation, your impression of that, whether you think we're about to be at a tipping point or you think we're still pushing up against some of these barriers that have been there for a while.
Anytime I look at initiatives coming in, whether good or bad, I find that there are always obstacles. And you and I have talked about this quite a bit, that you have vocal people who tell you all the reasons why they can't do something. So I think that the obstacles are always going to be there. When it comes to teacher leadership, I think we've always had, either formal or informal, we've had people in those kind of positions. And sometimes that's been a very positive experience because they're the ones that took on a very positive role within their school climate. And then there are other teachers that may have taken on a very negative role in their school climate because they were the ones who resisted everything. They were the ones who said, I can't. So I think what's at the tipping point is the idea that we're all having so many more conversations about it. And the super positive thing about it also is that we have social networking, something like Twitter, where we can have these fantastic conversations. So you're seeing more of those voices that may have been silos in their own schools coming together. And from, Jen moderated a great chat last night that I participated in. And you have all of these voices from literally all over the world coming together to talking about teacher leadership. And I think that that's why there is a bit of a tipping point, because we haven't had that in the past.
But I'm worried about that. You know, anything that comes to a tipping point, what's the first thing we do? Standardize it, train the heck out of it, you know, suck the life out of it. You know, what's been so powerful about teacher leadership up to this point is that it has flown under the radar so that people can define it in ways that make sense for their schools. But the moment we reach that tipping point, next thing you know, we're going to, I worry that we're going to saddle it with bad PD, where we turn teacher leaders into, you know, many APs and many principals, and there's a framework now for how I have to interact with my colleagues, whereas before it was a spontaneous conversation. And I'm not against PD, I'm in the PD business, so I don't want to say that, but we have to be very careful because this is a unique role, and right now there isn't a whole bunch of training for teacher leadership, but we can't make that training look exactly like the training we use to train administrators because it's a very different role. And until we understand the uniqueness of the role, that's what, you know, the idea that I'm still in the classroom, you know, until we understand how that factors in, until we understand that as a teacher leader, much of my power comes from my relationships, not from my position, and how do I navigate that? How do I manage my time when I also have papers to grade, but I'm also helping out in this way? So I think we have to be careful because I think we are at a tipping point, and what we do next will determine whether or not teacher leadership can be leveraged to make our schools better or whether we just suck the life out of the whole process.
I think that's a valid concern. I have to disagree that I'm not convinced we're at a tipping point. I think teachers in general are overwhelmed by other things happening in their daily lives professionally, and I'm not certain that enough of them are ready to take on a leadership role in a really meaningful way for us to truly be at a tipping point. But I think you're right, Peter. I think social media has given it a new life and brought it into vision for a lot of people, where things that weren't noticed before are noticed now. And it allows teacher leaders to not feel alone. So if you were isolated before, if you were alone in your building, or even in your district in some places, it gives you a network of people to grow with and to learn from. In spite of not thinking that we're at a tipping point, I do worry we will standardize it and and suck the life out of it.
Here's the other thing, because it's already happening, right? Leadership is, for many teacher evaluation systems, that professionalism standard. You can't get to the highest level unless you've exhibited some kind of leadership. But what does that look like? So we're already there where we're demanding, if you're going to be an exceptional teacher in your building, you have to exhibit some kind of leadership, which means that I think that if we're not at that tipping point, because I tend to kind of agree with you, I think we're almost there because it's going to be required. Any teacher who wants to get that highest evaluation will have to step into a leadership role. So it's no longer a choice or your destiny or all the things that led us to leadership before. Now it's simply a matter of survival. It's a matter of being able to meet the standards that are set by our states or by our provinces in terms of what we are required to do as leaders.
You know, for me, you raise a really good point, because I take the teacher piece out of that and look at the leader. And I think that it is dependent on who the leader is too, because as much as we're at a risk of the compliance stuff that drives me crazy, training teacher leaders, it also, for me, there's a dark side of teacher leadership. And as a teacher leader, somebody that we can have dialogue with one another. You're the teacher, I'm the principal, and we don't always agree, but we can come to a better idea from it. Or as a teacher leader, the person who just is delivering my message. And I think that that's the problem that I have seen in some schools, where teacher leaders mean something very different depending on what school and what school leader you have in that position.
Right. And why you come to teacher leadership, right?
Yes.
Because there are some people who come to teacher leadership as a first step towards being an administrator. Yes. So I've seen people in teacher leadership roles who walk into classrooms with laptops ready to evaluate teachers, and that creates that level of distrust. So we also have to reframe the conversation we're having with teachers around what leadership looks like, and give people who are interested in administration a better pathway to administration, because the whole idea about being a teacher leader is keeping that connection with the classroom. There are a lot of people who would occupy more leadership roles, but the first thing we do is we have a great teacher and we take that great teacher out of the classroom, which is just kind of crazy to me.
So in some ways we need two different tracks. We need a track of teacher leadership that's moving into an administration and a track of teacher leadership for those of us who have no interest in leaving the classroom, but would like to take on leadership roles in some other way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let me just clarify, because this is something, Robyn, because you were talking about that when if we are at a tipping point, the next thing we'll do is standardize these things, all right, and put regulations into them. And there are pros and cons to that. And you were talking about the cons, which is it becomes a more refined activity or a more specific activity, and we move away from the organic development as it might have been for a number of decades developing teachers. But is there a need for us to have those standards or have those certifications in order to promote the ability of teachers to become teacher leaders? Do you see the standards or certifications being an impediment, or do you see them possibly being a benefit?
I think that more than standards and certifications, and I may get in trouble for saying this, I think you need really good training first. I was a teacher leader, and I remember it's a tricky thing. One day we are colleagues, and the next day I am your coach, or I'm your mentor. And I never got any training. I got the title, I got the responsibility, I didn't get equipped to do that. And the training, it wasn't that my administrator was being negligent, it didn't exist. Yeah. And so how do I navigate my relationships with my colleagues? How do I give my colleagues feedback that's supportive but not evaluative? How do I build trust and rapport? And the biggest question I get asked is, how do I make those people listen to me? Especially when I don't have the positional power. You know, I can speak softly, but I don't have that big stick. And so the teachers who often need help the most are often the most resistant to the support of a teacher leader. So before I go standardizing and certify, I would rather see us outline what are the needs of a teacher leader, what kind of specific training do they need, and I'd like to see us delineate that role from other leadership roles in the building. Once we have that information, I think we're more equipped to standardize and certify in a way that doesn't stifle the power that really comes from teacher leaders.
Yeah, wonderful. And you talked a little bit about this in your last response, but much of your work has been around developing teacher leaders and in particular master instructional leaders. And in your recent book, Never Underestimate Your Teachers, you discuss the need to develop both the skill and the will of teachers. Mm-hmm. So can you outline what you mean by this and then how it relates back to teacher leadership?
Yeah, I mean, so the idea for a teacher leader is that I have to be able to step into somebody's practice and have a positive impact. And when you really think about what we normally think about as support for teachers, it's all around skill development. And everybody gets the same skill development, no matter where they are. And so the idea about will and skill, and in particular when it comes to teacher leaders, is I have to think about where you are and give you the help you need to help you to make the next step. When we think about master teachers, that moment, and I bet every teacher who is participating now can think of that moment when a colleague stepped into their practice and gave them the thing they needed to help them make that next step. Well, if I don't understand that, then I can't help you make the next step. I can help you make my next step, but I can't help you make the next step that's right for you. So you have to focus on the skill piece. But the other piece we ignore entirely a lot of times is the will piece. What if I give you the exact training you need, but you're resistant to it? So how do I handle that? And that becomes critical for a teacher leader because, again, I don't have, the threat of a bad evaluation to hold over you to make you receptive to what it is I'm trying to help you do. So I've got to have other strategies that help me enter into your practice in a way that's welcomed. And that's a challenge for teacher leaders, is that will piece. The bigger challenge is will impacts skill, skill impacts will, and so how do you navigate that? How do you do that? So it's about really, we talk about whole child but we don't talk about the whole teacher. And how do you impact the whole teacher? And in order to do that, you have to impact their will and their skill.
Yeah, and it's developing, as we mentioned in the first panel, that trust and respect and rapport with the teachers. And it's a lot of the work that you do or have been doing, Peter, about doing that. You also mentioned in your book about the difference between mentoring and coaching, because I think sometimes we talk about teacher leaders and we assume that it's either as a mentor or as a coach. And so maybe you can just extrapolate the difference there.
Sure. This is something I just came to understand recently because, you know, I use the words in many cases interchangeably, but when I'm mentoring a teacher, I'm helping that teacher navigate the day-to-day work, right? So for new teachers, for instance, I'm showing them where the copy machine is, and I'm telling them, hey, on Fridays we wear college sweatshirts, and we don't actually do parties in the school, and if you really want to get some help, don't talk to her, talk to her. Those are the things that help mentor me, that help me just survive the role that I'm in. Coaching is a lot more specific because it's about helping me develop or refine a particular skill. And someone who would make a good mentor is not always the person who makes a good coach. So being very clear and distinguishing those roles not only gives me better support as a teacher, but if I'm a teacher in a building who doesn't feel confident in my ability yet to coach, there's still a role for me. So we recommend a lot of times that second-year teachers mentor first-year teachers. Well, second-year teachers don't really have a lot of opportunities for leadership outside of that, but they're great first-year teacher mentors because they still remember what it was like to be first year in that building. So separating those roles creates more leadership opportunities and gives teachers a much more targeted support system and a broader support system to help them in all the aspects of their work.
And it's also hard for a new teacher, a second-year teacher, to be put in a position where they're teaching instructional skills.
Right.
Because they're still very often struggling themselves in maintaining what they need to maintain in the classroom and getting whatever content across the students as well. So in a way, I'm hearing the mentoring is more around building that trust and building that relationship, and the skill is more around some of the instructional development.
And the mentor is about helping you navigate the profession rather than specific support for instructional strategies. And that's an area we often neglect for teachers. Becoming a teacher, thinking like a teacher, takes time, and we give people support on the instructional strategies. We don't often support people on the other part, and that's a big reason why a lot of people wash out of the profession, quite frankly. It's not the kids, it's not the instruction, it's how do I have a life when I have all this homework to grade, or how am I supposed to live on this salary? And a mentor can help me with those kinds of things.
Yeah.
We've talked about this with working with pre-service teachers, that when you put a pre-service teacher in someone's classroom, you need them to be able to do both roles. Because we've placed pre-service teachers in a classroom and realized, wow, that person's great at coaching them instructionally, but they are a terrible mentor. And that is a horrible position for a pre-service teacher to be in. But you also don't want them to be a great mentor and be unable to give them support instructionally. So it's interesting to hear this thinking about teacher leaders and the roles they can play, and where you may not be good at both of them, but you can grow in the area that you do have strength.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Now, Peter, you're a recent ex-elementary school principal, correct? Recovering. So I want to get your impression about this story, and it's about a teacher-led school in Denver. I also know that you wrote something on your blog recently about some of these teacher-led schools in Denver, and we have part of the quote up on the screen here as well, but I'll read the full quote. And it says, all teachers in our school serve on at least one decision-making team. The school's current teams are professional development, technology, peer observation, evaluation, curriculum instruction, climate culture, and school leadership. Teachers at our school must be willing and able not only to make easy decisions, but also to engage in difficult conversations with one another about school-level policies and instructional practices. Without a designated boss, teachers must step up and engage in dialogue about how best to serve students without taking things personally. Why would we design a teacher-led school? Was it because we think principal-led schools are ineffective? Absolutely not. The choice to be a teacher-led school was a decision for kids, not against anything or anyone, to attract the most highly skilled teachers to serve high-need students, we had to make it clear that teachers would have the authority and autonomy to make authentic decisions on behalf of students. So that was an article called Portrait of a Teacher-Led School from Educational Leadership by Laurie Nazarino. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know you have been a very progressive principal. So I want to get your impression about this model and also what it means about developing teacher leaders.
I love the idea of it. I mean, for me, it goes back to what Robyn was talking about a little bit earlier too, is the more we talk about it, is it going to become standardized and everybody's going to start their own teacher-run school. And just because I was a principal, I don't necessarily think that every school needs one. And I know that might sound very odd coming from a school principal, but in my role, I always felt like I was the facilitator of learning. I came directly from teaching second grade in a city school to becoming a principal in a suburban rural school. And I always felt like it was my job to connect people together because I knew what was going on in each grade level. And maybe they were both doing literature circles, but at different grade levels, and they could learn from one another. The idea of a teacher-led school I love, because I think when we dream of starting a school, we want that democratic process. One of the biggest things that I think a school leader has to deal with is when you're going from a classroom where you know how you run a classroom and how you work with kids, and then going to a school building where you look and say, oh wow, not everybody teaches the same way I do. And there were strengths and weaknesses all over the board. I do like the idea of it. I actually have a friend who started her own school about 2 years ago in Clifton Park, New York, just north of where I live. And I love the democratic process. I think it taps into my work with John Hattie, because John, devotes a lot of work to feedback and teacher-student relationships, which have a high effect size, and I think that can be very positive. So I think there are a lot of positives about it. You referenced the blog that I wrote, which was Do Schools Need Principals? Which initiates a lot of interesting responses through Twitter and comments on EdWeek and everywhere else. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about within that blog was the idea of providing feedback to one another, but also the concerns are in the sad day and age of school safety. What does that look like? Because that was always one of my number one roles as a school principal. Not that I was in the main office all the time because I was in the classrooms, but who is taking on that kind of role? So those are the little things that you think of that are actually very big things. So how does that work in a teacher-run school? In order to do this positively, you have to have the best staff. You have to have people that are okay with, we were talking in the back about providing feedback to one another. You have to be okay with people who disagree with you. As a school principal, I was good with that. I had those structures in place where I chose teachers who were going to disagree with me because I felt it would make a decision much stronger. Are people all equipped for being able to do that in a teacher-run school? I think that we need schools to look very different. I think that there are definitely positives where this is concerned, and it's nice to see where they're going. I think there are probably a lot more out there than we may know about.
Yeah. No, I actually have one of the quotes or one of the comments from your article as well.
One of the positive ones?
One of the positive ones, yeah. There were some that were deleted, but I didn't tackle those. But the person, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is there's a differentiation between being a manager of a school site or an administrator or being a teacher leader around instruction. And the comment was, there is too quick a tendency to equate leadership with principles, and this forced equation often is at odds with reality. Principals are administrators, not leaders. And the assumption that one is naturally the other creates a command and control scenario. Do we need administrators? Perhaps, but we need leaders more. And whether that comes from the principal or from someone else is not as important as allowing that leadership to take place.
Yeah, that was an interesting comment. I feel like, and it's just because of the place that I was in, that as a school principal, I was the school leader. I was the, one really interesting phrase that's out there these days is being the lead learner. trying to facilitate learning at faculty meetings and any sort of structural meeting that you have in place. So I disagree with that comment to a certain extent, which you could probably see in my comment back to him, was that I do think school principals need to be leaders. The interesting point about what he was saying in there as well is that whether we're talking about teacher leaders or whatever we're talking about, grading, feedback, whatever the discussion may be, that leadership position is really, really key. Todd Whitaker, somebody I'm a huge fan of, wrote a book many years ago about what great principals do differently, and he said when the principal sneezes, the whole school catches a cold.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I have just totally bought into that quotation from the first time I read it as a school principal. I feel like you have to be there, and we get this sort of sense that teacher leaders, it's about somebody who's going to stand higher than everybody else. And I look at leadership from a very different lens. I look at it from, the servant leadership piece, where we're there to see something in kids and teachers that they don't see in themselves. And if a teacher-run school is something that can, do that, I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I don't think, back to Robyn's initial point, that everything has to be so cookie cutter. I worry about these days that things have become so cookie cutter that schools can't look different.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let me take that a little bit further, and I want to get your impression about how we should be developing teacher leaders. And really, should it be the result of a group of progressive teachers or even a progressive supportive principal? Or should it be more purposeful? Should we have something which is defined and designated, or should we be waiting for the opportunities with the right culture and the right climate?
Back when I was on my third community college that I didn't drop out of, I had a professor who said, "It depends." And it was kind of a statement that ruined me for the rest of my life, because I feel like there is no one answer for all of this. I do think that there are principals that need to foster this in teachers. And, much to what Robyn and Jen were saying earlier, a principal is somebody that should be differentiating their instruction for their teachers like they did for their students when they were a teacher.
Yeah.
And it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Maybe I wasn't articulate enough when I was with my opening statement, but the whole idea is that there are so many teachers within a school that have so many different strengths that if we actually could foster those within, imagine how strong a school could be. So I think that there are many different venues to be able to do this. I was a graduate adjunct in a school of education, and there were pre-service teachers that I worried about because they just didn't have a sense of why they wanted to become a teacher. And then you could see some there that clearly stood out. They were early, they got everything done, they wanted to spend time with you after class. I think there are so many different venues that we can do, but it kind of goes back to what they were saying earlier as well, is that we are so busy running in so many different directions that if we had time to reflect, we would probably come up with better formats to be able to foster this. But we're spending so much time chasing mandates and accountability measures that don't always make sense, that we aren't finding time to do some of the right work.
Yeah, I want to jump in on the training piece, because that's just something that's really important to me and something I'm playing around with now and starting to try to figure out and untangle and develop. And I think I agree with you that it depends, right? I think we have to define what leadership, I think we have to redefine what leadership is in schools. Because I think that if we had a clearer definition of what a leader looks like, then I think more people would naturally step into the role because they're doing it already. So I think that we have to do that first, and then I think we need to give people frameworks around what leadership should look like in our building, so that we don't. I think with a framework, that it leaves the flexibility to make things organic to what we need in our building, but gives us the standardization we need to be able to make sure that we have quality leadership happening. I worry about the over-standardization, but I also worry about things being so loose that, hey, listen, I'm in charge of all of the smart boards, and so that's my leadership role in the building. They're two very different things. So I think that there needs to be training, and in particular, I keep getting back to this point because I see it as such a need. As a teacher, I know how to reach students. I don't have the training to reach adults. And it's a very different role. And it's also a very different role, we see leadership as I'm up front and you follow me, right? But when we're talking about teacher leadership, I walk alongside you. How do I do that? How do I enter into that relationship? What's off limits? How do I establish trust? How do I make sure that I don't violate that trust? How do I refrain from enforcing my view and help you develop in a way that makes sense for who you are as a teacher? Because a lot of times the coaching I received as a teacher was, well, this is what I do in my classroom. Mm-hmm. And that's not leadership, that's not coaching. But if I only know my classroom, I don't really have anything else to offer but what I do in my classroom. So I think that there needs to be training. I think that the training doesn't need to be so regimented that it becomes the script for what you do when you're talking to your colleagues, but there are frameworks that we could develop that give people ground to stand on when I take on a leadership role, that help me step into that role in a way that empowers me to have a big impact, because that's why we came here. That's what we want. Whether it's in my own classroom or whether it's working with my colleagues, we're attracted to education because we can make such a huge impact. So why not empower and equip people to make that impact by giving them the framework, but leaving them the flexibility to make that framework work for me, because leadership looks different in different schools. I worked with a school once where the teachers took on a leadership role and they set all the policies of the school and the principal let them drive. Well, those teachers, he spent years preparing and hiring teachers to be able to do that. I've been in other schools where the principal is the lead, but teachers are invited to be a part of that conversation. And that's what leadership looks like. I've been in other schools where there isn't good leadership from the top, so there's this underground leadership movement happening among the teachers. So if we get too standardized, we lose the power to make leadership work to move every school forward.
Yeah. Do you think that, let me throw something out there, it's just a question that came into my head the last couple of minutes, which is basically, would you say that the schools where they're teaching collaboration, problem solving, cooperation skills more typically in the classrooms are more likely to be schools where you can foster and develop teacher leadership because you're taking what's already taking place in the classrooms and expanding it to the bigger setting? Or is that too much of a jump?
No, I think yes, but what I was thinking about when you were asking that question is that yes, that's where you see it and it's more visible, but there's teacher leadership happening everywhere. Sometimes it happens at the bar down the street. Sometimes it happens off campus, where teachers are leading, and sometimes that leadership is good, and sometimes people are using their powers for evil instead of good in terms of leadership. So the idea is that, yeah, I think in that situation you can leverage that leadership, you can formalize it, you can make leadership more visible. But when you were asking that question, I was thinking about the opposite of school that doesn't have any of that, and there's underground lead. And I've worked in those schools. I've been in schools where, someone comes in and gives me the same quality leadership offline, off campus, away. And then there are teachers who are looking for leadership outside of their schools because they can't find it in their school, so they're going to Twitter. And that's, that's where we were talking about earlier. They're turning to Twitter or they're turning to other places to find the leadership that they can't find in their school. So ideally, yes, but in reality, it's still happening.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's, isn't that what you're seeing with Twitter, that you're seeing a lot of people going to Twitter to find leadership?
To find leadership, to find support for their own personal growth as a leader, to find a network of people that they lack in their schools, and even possibly in their districts. It's really fascinating to me, being someone who's come from schools and a district where I have felt a lot of great support and leadership. And honestly, it hadn't even occurred to me that for others that's not so true. And Twitter has been eye-opening for me in the way that it's been a support for others.
Education Week was really important for me a few years ago because I've started writing for them 3.5 years ago. So I would talk about things that leaders did. And boy, did I hear that no, that was not what leaders did. And that really opened up my frame of reference. And you're right, where Twitter is concerned, it's almost safer for people because they can have these conversations that they don't have to worry about, back in school, which seems odd because they're having these conversations in an open format. But that's almost safer for some people. And, really also what you're talking about is kind of it's a school climate issue, isn't it? Depending on, you talk about the leader and what the leader might look like and fostering whatever, that's definitely a school climate, and there are lots of school climates where the principal might be the micromanager as opposed to anybody that's going to foster because they play whack-a-mole because they don't want somebody to stand up, or the people that they allow to stand up are the ones who are only going to agree with them. And so there's a lot more to teacher leadership than just that alone.
You raise a good point.
Thank
because
you.
we've been talking about, yes.
Because I want to go to the bar down the street where they're having this conversation. Just putting that out there.
And see, as a principal, you would never be invited. I mean, that's the whole thing, right?
Oh, that just hurt. My teachers would invite me.
Well, but you raise a good point about the fact that we talk about training the leaders, but we don't talk about the PD that has to happen for the principal.
Yeah.
Because a lot of principals have the idea that as the principal, the buck stops here, and they're not wrong. But the journey to getting to that point could be enhanced, improved by leveraging the leadership in the building. But that's not a part of principal training as far as I know.
Well, it's interesting you say that too, because I thought that earlier with the kinds of things you were saying we need to train teacher leaders to do. And I thought, I'm not convinced we train principals to do that, in spite of the fact that they're doing it. I, at one point, took all but one of the courses to be endorsed in administration and supervision in my state before really coming to recognize that that was not where I wanted to be at all. And nowhere in there was there, aside from phenomenal professors who would talk about relationship building, that was not built into the program, the kinds of things that we believe teacher leaders need to be able to do and principals should be able to do. So training for that, you're right, needs to be happening at multiple levels.
How do I train a teacher leader? I mean, how do I leverage one? How do I empower people to lead, especially when I'm not quite sure myself in those areas? I didn't mean to cut.
No. Jen and I were kind of tweeting back and forth about this last night during the Twitter chat, and I had put out a tweet, which something 5 years ago I never thought I would be saying in public, that I never wanted to be a school principal. So you raise a good point. I was working in a city school, and the principal had been there for 50 years, not 15, 50.
Holy moly.
And I was going back to do a master's degree, and he said, I think you should do it in school administration. And I actually said to him, I don't want to be a principal. I would never be a principal. And I had two guys, one was a former teacher, one was a guidance counselor, who said, but what if you could lead the way you wanted to? And it goes back to what Sean was saying, asking a little bit earlier too. Sometimes I think our circumstances bring us to leadership. Backstage I was telling you that I was retained in 4th grade. I barely graduated from high school. I was ranked 4th in the last of my class. I'm the youngest of 5, the first to go to college. My mom went back to get her GED after my dad died. By all circumstances, I was not supposed to be anything. I mean, I actually had some teachers tell me that I should focus on a 2-year school because I wouldn't get any further. And I look at the circumstances that I had, so I was open. By the time I got, first of all, my kids taught me a lot, my students taught me a lot, because they came from circumstances that were much worse than anything that I had ever imagined. And then when I became a teacher, and I had spent 11 years being a teacher, when I became a principal after that, it was my staff that actually helped me grow. They were the ones who gave me the training because I was open to what they were saying. It doesn't mean we always agreed with one another, but I really wanted to make sure that we had open dialogue. And I say these things in public, I write about them all the time. My staff would be more than happy to tell you if I was lying. But we had that kind of open dialogue. So when I look at training, I look at the fact that I was open to what my staff was doing. And some administrators aren't necessarily open to that because they feel insecure about putting themselves in that position. And that's unfortunate because they're really missing out on a great opportunity to not only foster leadership within themselves, but also see the leadership that they have around their building.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's crucial. We wrote and we talked a lot about the role of the principal in developing that climate and that culture in the school. And you can have, the best training in the world for teacher leaders, but if the principal isn't ready for it and they're the gatekeeper of the climate very often in that school, then it's really not going to move. It's not going to happen.
So are you now admitting that you were my co-author?
Yes, I am.
Because you didn't say that. Felt like witness protection.
Guilty as charged. So I think so. It's a twofold approach. You can't just focus on teachers. You need to focus on the whole environment, the whole ecosystem.
And can I just say one more thing about that training for anybody out there who's thinking about training principals on this? Don't make the principals attend the same training that you're providing for the teacher leaders and call that training the principals. Principals need specific and separate training that it looks very different from the training of the teacher leader. It's not something where you can just assemble everybody in the same room and say, here's what teacher leadership is. It's two very separate roles that need two very separate skill sets, and managing that is its own issue.
Well, it is, because one is actually acquiring skills and more responsibility, and the other one is actually relinquishing some of those and being comfortable about that.
Yeah.
And seeing that you're not undermining your role, you're actually building up and supporting your role and position.
I think that's tweetable.
Tweetable?
I think that's tweetable.
It was bound to happen.
Yeah.
So Jen, let's go to the person who is the teacher leader, because you are a 2013 emerging leader. So can you tell us a little bit about when you began to consider yourself as a teacher leader and how it happened, whether it was an organic process or you were encouraged or led or a system?
I was actually really lucky. I started my career with a once-in-a-lifetime principal. And looking back, I began as a fourth grade teacher with a really limited set of knowledge and skills, which did not stop her from seeing me as a leader. And she made that really clear from the very beginning, from my first year teaching. And she encouraged me to take on leadership roles very early on as teacher leader, as team leader. She encouraged me to present at conferences. She encouraged me to join associations like ASCD and others. She encouraged me to collaborate with people beyond my team to help me grow as a professional. And not only did she encourage me, she gave me these opportunities and made it possible for me to do that. And she was my principal for my first 5 years of teaching, which, given 17 years in, isn't really very much. And yet, I think that was transformational for me. She gave me, by seeing me as a teacher leader, she gave me the confidence to see myself that way, and the confidence to take risks that I don't think I would ever have taken without that, to work with pre-service teachers, which I started doing very early, to do my national board certification, which I did the very first year I possibly could do it, because it didn't even occur to me not to do it. And I don't know how conscious a decision that was for her. It would be interesting to talk to her now, or whether that was simply how she treated everyone, and it was a matter of whether or not you felt a need or an interest in taking on those roles. I've also been really lucky to work with other administrators and colleagues who've helped me become the teacher and the leader that I am now. And not every teacher is as lucky to be within a gold mine of such colleagues and administrators.
Yeah, you were talking before about how the way that you teach and the way that you do professional development in your school is different than what other people might say. And so I think you're in a fortuitous position.
Yes, I've been very lucky.
Are there things that would have helped your progress, or that there are things that hindered your progress? Would having a scaffold or a framework or professional development or, Twitter invented, 17 years ago, would that have helped?
I actually do think that the fact that by the time I started teaching, the internet existed was a real boon. It did allow me access to a world beyond my school and gave me perspectives that I wouldn't otherwise have had. Twitter has, and the blogs that I can read and the ways I can interact with people internationally has definitely expanded that. But I'm really not certain how people taught pre-internet. Kind of amazed by it. So I've been lucky enough to only do that. I was very early on in the internet, but still. So I think I just was very lucky. I do think there are teachers who either are in a building without that level of support or a district without that level of support, where there need to be some more specific structures in place to give them those opportunities. Some people will take those opportunities whether they're offered or not. I mean, there are teachers out there who are going to become leaders regardless of what obstacles might be in their way. Yeah. But if we rely on that, we lose a lot of really phenomenal teachers. I can think of teachers I work with right now who can become really amazing teacher leaders, but I don't think they know that about themselves yet. Mm-hmm. And I think they're going to need somebody to step in and say, hey, do you want to present at this conference with me? Mm-hmm. Or hey, let's go have a meeting with so-and-so. I really want them to hear about how you're doing such and such. Mm-hmm. So even if it's simply somebody else kind of giving them that little nudge, that was something we were hearing a lot from people last night, was they can pinpoint that one time where somebody pushed them and empowered them and gave them the confidence to take on a leadership role, and it snowballed.
Yeah.
I have a couple of quotes for people here, and they're on the screen again, and I'll read them out. But the question is going to come down to, what role do teachers themselves have to play in forcing the issue of change? So should teachers be waiting for these things to appear? Should they be waiting for frameworks or professional development to be developed? Or should they be pushing the issue more? And this again was Arnie Duncan at the National Board of Professional Teaching Standards Teaching and Learning Conference. And he said, according to a new poll, 69% of teachers feel their voices are heard in the school, but only 1/3 feel heard in their district, 5% in their state, and 2% at the national level. That's unacceptable, and it's time to change that. And David Berliner, somewhat in response to this, because it was in a similar article, talks about it's time for educators to stop taking the rap for a society that has allowed a 30-year drift into poverty for so many families. Teacher leaders need to get into political positions and right these wrongs. Teachers who stand together in solidarity can force responsible changes in education. So, and we talked about this a little bit in the previous symposium, about what role teachers should have in forcing change and not just waiting for change. And so I'd like to open that up and get your impressions about.
I'm stressed out just reading that. And here's why. I was trained as a high school English teacher, and if you talk to me about teaching adolescents to enjoy reading, I can talk to you about it all day. Okay. I don't know anything about policy, right? I can tell you what I need, but I don't know how to put it in the language of policy. And so there's a lot of pressure on teachers to push for change, but most teachers want to just teach. Yeah. They just want to work with their students. And entering into the political arena takes a skill set that's almost antithetical to teaching. And so selling me that I have to go out now and push for this change, I just feel ill-equipped to do that. And I think a lot of teachers, one of the reasons why we don't see more teachers doing that, it's because they feel ill-equipped to do it. We need it, but it stresses me out just thinking about it.
We don't want you stressed. So.
I will get a little political. The first quotation bothers me because I don't think you can be partly responsible for the dialogue about how teachers are bad and then say it's time to change it. I think that you need to, and so I worry that quotation's a little bit disingenuous on his part. For me, I feel like there are groups of teachers that are trying to change it. You know, you see the bats, that they're trying to at least control some dialogue. I think when you look on Twitter and you see people talking through social media, I think you're also seeing people come together and they're trying to build the network, because you're right, it does go against how teachers necessarily feel, but it also goes back to the first quotation that, why speak up? I don't have a voice anyway. I mean, that's why people don't vote, right? Because they don't feel like anything they say is going to change. So how do we empower people to say, it is up to you to step forward and make some of these changes? I think that there are teachers out there that don't need an open door, they just need an open window, like Jen. That they need somebody to see something within themselves that they don't see. But the problem is the dialogue and I'm thankful for ASCD, not just because I'm here and because I get to write a book with you, but because you put out that positive dialogue through educational leadership or whatever you do for the whole, I mean, for me, the Whole Child initiative is the most important initiative that we have in education. And it's a positive dialogue about a positive way schools need to change instead of the hammer method where, you know, we just hammer people to death because of we want to make them feel like they're failures. So I think that we just need to continue having this kind of dialogue and bring people on board to know that they can be a positive part of this.
And equip people with the language. So one of the reasons teachers don't feel like they have a voice is because they say this kind of thing all the time and nobody listens. And the reason that a lot of people don't listen is because we're talking teacher talk and they're listening with political ears. So, you know, part of the stress that I often feel when people say you need to go out and do that, I agree, but give me the language, give me the tools. That politics is its own game. Policy is its own thing. And so if you're going to send me out there to express how I feel, give me the language to express it in a way that people can actually hear it. And I think that's what's missing from a lot of the empowering of teachers. We're using old models. We should be using, politics has evolved. We need to evolve, our political understanding needs to evolve with it. Give me the language to be able to say, to be heard. Show me how to be heard in a political arena.
I think it's even bigger than that, though. I look at that quote from Arnie Duncan and I think, we don't feel heard at a district or state or national level, and that doesn't surprise me. We're not invited into that conversation. We haven't figured out how to put ourselves in that conversation, and I don't expect to be invited. We're gonna have to figure out how to put ourselves in that conversation as teachers. And I do mean as teachers, not only administrators and district level, but the people doing the day-to-day work with students every day need to be in that conversation. But what concerns me the most is that almost a third of teachers don't feel heard in their school. He throws that 69% out as if that's perfectly okay. And that is by no means okay. If they don't feel heard in their school, they're never gonna lift their voices higher than that.
But you also know that when that's 69%, there'll be some schools that are 80, 90, 100%, and there'll be subsequently some schools which are 40, 30, 20%.
But don't just give them the talking points, also give them the support. I find that one of the infuriating things for me, and it's something I've written a lot about for the Finding Common Ground blog, is that I used to sit with administrators that would complain about changes behind closed doors, absolutely complain, and then they would get out in front and they would make the changes happen. And that's a problem for me because you're complaining about them and saying how bad they are, but you're making them work. And so teachers will step forward too if they know that they have the support where they can have a voice. And I get it. I mean, I was a practicing public school principal and I was very vocal about the insane changes that were happening in New York State, which is where I live, and the implementation of the Common Core. And the accountability and mandates that are happening in New York State, I was very outspoken. I luckily had a superintendent at the time who supported me, but the New York State Education Department came calling my office to get me to change my blog. Those things really happen for people. And you need to know that as a school administrator, if you're so frustrated with the changes, why aren't you speaking up about them too? Because teachers might follow suit if they know that they're gonna have your support.
Now we're pretty much out of time, but I gave the last panel a chance to say a last word before we go to Q&A. So if you want to make a parting statement before we go to our question and answers, you are welcome to. You don't have to.
I guess for me, the most important thing when I think about teacher leaders is that there is nobody in education who knows students the way that teacher leaders know students. And that's why their voice is so critical, because everything we do in education needs to be about our students.
My mother taught me not to throw gravy on stuff that's already well said, so I'll agree.
I think I'll throw a little bit gravy. From a school administrator standpoint, I feel like it is, I know we're busy with everything, but it is your job to foster that within teachers because you're absolutely right. They know the kids, so foster that within your staff.
And work with that potential that you have in the school. Wonderful. I'd like you to thank my second panel here. Peter, Robyn, Jen.